The sound came first, before anyone understood what they were seeing. A single, brutal crack split the warm hum of the copper magnolia, dry and final, like a length of seasoned oak snapped clean across the grain. Conversations died mid-sentence. A spoon stilled against the rim of a cup. For one suspended second, the entire cafe held its breath, and every pair of eyes turned toward the man standing at the counter. A handprint was already rising on his cheek, an angry red blooming up toward a thin, pale scar that traced down from his temple. Old, healed, the kind of mark a face only earns once. Yet the man did not move. He did not lift his fingers to the sting. He did not step back, did not square his shoulders, did not so much as blink. He only stood there, one arm folded around a small boy pressed tight against his chest, absorbing the blow the way deep earth absorbs a falling stone. The boy was shaking. 6 years old, swallowed in a flannel shirt 3 sizes too big. His little fists knotted into his father's collar as if letting go would mean falling forever. The man's hand moved slowly across the child's back, patient, unhurried, a rhythm that did not belong to a frightened person at all. The woman who had struck him was still breathing hard, her palms still warm from the contact. She had expected him to crumble. She had expected the flinch, the stammered apology, the small surrender that men like him always offered women like her. Everything about him had whispered harmless, the sawdust in the creases of his knuckles, the worn boots, the cheap watch, the patched sneakers on the child clutching a chipped wooden horse. She had measured him in a single glance and found him beneath her notice. So when he finally turned his face back toward hers, what she found there stopped the breath in her throat. Not rage, not fear, something colder and far steadier. The calm of a man who has already weighed exactly how much he is willing to allow and has not yet reached the line. "Are you finished?" he asked. 3 quiet words. No threat behind them, no heat. And somehow they landed harder than her hand ever could. Near the window, a phone tilted upward, its small red light already blinking. What the woman didn't know, couldn't have known, standing there in a $4,000 suit with the sting still alive in her fingers, was that she had just slapped a man whose name was spoken with care in rooms she would never be allowed to enter. She did not know that for 11 years he had walked into places his own government swore had never existed. She did not know that generals lowered their voices when they said his name, or that the men he had carried out of fire still went silent when they called him by his rank. And she had no idea that the most dangerous thing in that cafe was not what those scarred hands could do, but the will that was keeping them perfectly, deliberately still. She had spent her whole life certain that power was the loudest thing in any room. She was about to learn it was the quietest. Before we go any further, where are you listening from tonight? Drop your city or your country in the comments, because some stories were never meant to stay in one place. And if you believe that real strength lives in restraint, not in fury, take a moment to like and subscribe. What happened next in that small Charleston cafe would shake an empire to the ground. 6 hours earlier, there had been no slap. There had only been a cold workshop, a stack of unpaid invoices, and the particular quiet of a man counting what little he had left. Caleb Monroe woke before dawn the way he always did, without an alarm, his eyes open in the dark a full second before his mind caught up. The loft above his rented carpentry shop held the night's chill in its bones, and the space heater had clicked off sometime past 3 to save what was left on the electric bill. On the workbench downstairs sat the reason for the cold, a half-finished walnut cabinet ordered by a contractor named Del Pruitt, who had collected the piece 2 days ago, praised the joinery, and then stopped answering his phone. $1,100. Gone, most likely, the way the last 3 slow-paying jobs had gone. Folded in the breast pocket of Caleb's flannel was a single sheet of paper he had read so many times the creases were starting to soften. A notice to vacate. 30 days. The landlord was not cruel, only tired of waiting, And Caleb did not blame him. Hannah's illness had eaten through the savings, the survivor's benefits, the truck he had sold, and finally the wedding ring he had pawned 8 weeks ago without telling a soul. Grief, he had learned, was not the worst of it. The worst of it was the arithmetic that came after, the long, silent ledger of a life subtracted down to almost nothing. And yet that morning, Caleb did something that made no financial sense at all. He knelt by the cot in the corner, shook a small shoulder gently, and said, "Come on, bud, we're going to get hot chocolate." Because Eli had made it a full week without an asthma attack. 7 nights. No 3 a.m. rattle in the small chest, no inhaler shaken in the dark, no drive to the urgent care with the heater roaring and a 6-year-old wheezing in the passenger seat. To anyone else, it would have been an ordinary week. To Caleb, it was a victory, and he had learned long ago that some victories only a father can see, and that a man should celebrate them while he still can, before the world finds a new way to take something away. Eli sat up, blinking, and the first thing his hand found in the dark was the wooden horse. Captain went everywhere. Caleb had carved it from a block of soft pine 2 winters back, and Hannah, thin by then, a scarf wound around her head, but laughing, had painted it a deep, careful blue, steadying her wrist with her other hand. "Every captain needs a color," she had said. It was the last thing she ever made with him. Now the blue had worn pale at the muzzle where small fingers gripped it, and Eli would no more leave it behind than leave his own heartbeat on the pillow. They walked into town as the sky went gray to gold. Eli's sneakers had a hole worn clean through the left toe, and Caleb made a mental note to find a fix, knowing the note would join 100 others he could not yet afford. The copper magnolia was already humming when they stepped inside, full of soft money and softer talk. Caleb steered his son toward a corner table without thinking about why. A table with its back to the wall and a clear line to the front door, the side exit, and the hallway beyond. Old habits did not retire when the man did. To everyone else he was just a tired carpenter buying his boy a treat. Only another soldier would have noticed the way his eyes mapped the room before he ever sat down. They had been at the corner table perhaps 10 minutes, Eli swinging his legs, Captain standing guard beside a steaming mug, Caleb letting the warmth of the room do the small, rare work of feeling almost normal, when the front door opened and the temperature of the whole cafe seemed to change. Adrienne Crane did not walk into the Copper Magnolia so much as annex it. She came through the door the way a hostile takeover comes through a boardroom, fast, certain, expecting the ground to rearrange itself around her stride. A white suit, sharp as a folded blade. Sunglasses she did not bother to remove. Heels that struck the reclaimed pine floor like a clock counting down to something. Behind her trailed 2 assistants, both clutching tablets and wearing the particular pallor of people who had been shouted at recently and expected to be again. And a step back from all of them moved a broad, silent man in a dark coat, his eyes sweeping the room in a slow, professional arc that Caleb noticed at once and filed away without expression. That was Marcus Webb, though Caleb did not yet know the name. Only the walk, the watchfulness, the way the man's gaze checked corners the way a soldier's does. The name Crane meant something, even this far from New York. Crane Meridian was an empire built of glass towers and government contracts, luxury developments stacked on top of federal construction deals, and Adrienne Crane had inherited the bones of it and then doubled it with her own teeth. The business pages called her formidable. The people who had worked for her used quieter words. That week she was in Charleston to close the largest deal of her career, a federal contract worth hundreds of millions to build housing for military families and a sprawling medical complex for veterans, the kind of signature the Pentagon photographed for press releases. She was building homes for soldiers. She simply did not see the one standing in front of her. "I don't care what the regional office thinks it needs," she was saying into her phone as she cut past the line, her voice pitched to be overheard. "Tell them the numbers are final, or tell them to find a new general contractor by Friday." She reached the counter without once glancing at the 8 people already waiting. A young man near the front turned, 19, maybe 20, a community college backpack on one shoulder, and a name tag from somewhere else still clipped to his jacket. "Sorry, ma'am, the line actually starts back." "Does it?" Adrian lowered the phone a fraction and looked at him over the rim of her sunglasses, the way one looks at a stain on a sleeve. "I make more before my coffee than you'll see all semester. Proximity isn't relevance. Stand aside." His name was Theo Hayes, and his ears went red as he stepped back, and several people studied the floor with sudden interest. Caleb watched all of it from the corner. He had seen the type in a dozen uniforms and a dozen languages, the conviction that money and worth were the same currency, that a raised voice was a kind of authority. Something in him registered the cruelty the way it registered every door and exit, noted, weighed, set aside. Eli had glanced up at the sharp voice, and Caleb laid a quiet hand on the boy's wrist, a small wordless, "Not ours." Because he had learned the hard way that not every arrogant person in a room was his to deal with. His assignment sat across from him in mended sneakers, drinking hot chocolate, entirely unaware that the woman at the counter was already moving toward them both. It was Eli who decided, the way 6-year-olds do, that he was a big boy now. He had finished his muffin, and the crumpled paper liner sat on the table like an unfinished chore. And Eli announced, with the gravity of someone shouldering a great responsibility, that he would throw it away himself. Caleb almost told him to leave it. He didn't. There was a particular pride lighting the boy's face, the pride of a child who had been brave at the doctor and patient through a hard year, and a father learns to let those small victories stand. So Eli slid off the chair, captain clamped in one hand, the muffin wrapper in the other, and set off toward the trash bin near the counter with the careful, deliberate steps of a tiny diplomat on a mission. Caleb's eyes tracked him without thought. Bin, 15 feet. Open lane. Counter-traffic light. It was an old reflex, the constant low arithmetic of where everyone in a space was going to be in 3 seconds, and the arithmetic returned an answer he did not like. Adrian Crane had turned from the register, phone up, eyes down, walking fast on a line that intersected his son's exactly. "Eli, stop!" The command cut across the café, low and absolute, the voice of a man used to being obeyed instantly. Eli froze mid-step. But Adrian, reading something on a screen, never slowed and never looked up, and she came around the corner of the pastry case and walked directly into the small body in front of her. The impact spun Eli sideways. He went down hard against the floor with a startled cry, the wrapper fluttering loose, and Captain leapt from his open hand, skidded across the reclaimed pine, and came to rest beneath the descending point of a white designer heel. The wood gave way with a small, sickening crack. For one terrible second, the café held its breath around that sound. Eli sat sprawled on the floor, stunned, and then his eyes found the 2 pieces of blue-painted pine lying apart on the boards, and a sound came out of him that had nothing to do with the fall. A thin, breaking wail, the cry of a child watching something irreplaceable end. Adriana did not look at the boy. She looked at her shoe. She lifted her foot, examined the faint pale scuff the toy had left on the leather, and her face hardened into something cold and disgusted. "Do you have any idea what these cost?" she said. Not a question. An accusation hurled downward at the weeping child on the floor. "You filthy little brat! Where is your mother? Who lets a child crawl around a place like this, like an animal?" Her hand came down toward his arm, as if to haul him up and out of her way. She never reached him, because to Eli the ruined shoe meant nothing, and the bruise blooming on his hip meant nothing. What he saw, through the blur of tears, were the two halves of a blue horse his mother had painted with a shaking hand in the last good winter of her life. Captain, the captain who needed a color, broken on a stranger's floor. He gathered the pieces against his chest and sobbed into them. And somewhere across the cafe, a man who had buried that same woman rose silently from a corner table, and the morning began, at last, to turn toward the sound that would shake an empire. No one saw Caleb cross the room. One moment the corner table was occupied. The next he was simply there, standing between his son and the woman reaching for him. A wall of worn flannel and quiet weight that had appeared in the space where harm had been about to land. He did not shove her. He did not raise his voice. He only put his body where danger had no permission to pass and let his stillness do the rest. Adriana's outstretched hand stopped of its own accord, some old animal instinct in her recoiling from a thing it could not name. Caleb crouched without ever taking his eyes off her and gathered Eli up into his arms. The boy buried his wet face in his father's neck, the two halves of Captain still clutched against his chest. "I've got you, bud," Caleb murmured, one large hand cradling the small head. "I'm right here." Then he rose to his full height, the child light against him, and looked at the woman who had done this. "You walked into him because you were staring at your phone," he said. Calm, even, each word set down like a tool laid in its place. "You're going to lower your voice. You're going to apologize to my son, and then you're going to go." Adrian looked him over, and Caleb watched her do the math, the same math she had done to the boy at the counter, the sawdust in the seams of his knuckles, the frayed collar, the cheap watch, the scuffed boots, the patched sneaker dangling from the child's foot. Poor, powerless, disposable. He could see the conclusion arrive in her eyes, and he could see how certain she was of it, and he knew from long experience how often that particular certainty got people hurt. "Apologize," she repeated and laughed, a short, brittle sound. "Your feral little animal ruined a $4,000 shoe, and you want me to apologize to him?" Her chin lifted. "I am Adrian Crane. I sign deals with the federal government before most people have finished their coffee. I do not get lectured in a coffee shop by some sawdust tradesman who can't afford to dress his own kid." Eli flinched at the word animal, shrinking deeper into his father's shoulder. Caleb felt the small body shudder against him, and his breathing, without his deciding it, began to slow. "Don't talk about my son again," he said quietly. But Adrian Crane had lived too long without anyone telling her no, and a boundary to her was only an insult that hadn't been answered yet. She stepped closer, lowering her voice into something almost intimate, almost pleased. "Or what? You'll do something? Go ahead." Her mouth curved. "I'll have Child Protective Services at whatever hole you crawled out of by tonight. I'll tell them you threatened me, that the boy's a danger to himself, that his father's unfit. You people always are." She tilted her head. "He'll be gone before you finish your sad little drink." The cafe had gone very quiet. Caleb did not answer right away. Something behind his eyes had changed, not flared, but cooled, the way a workshop cools when the machines all stop at once. "Take her," the woman had said. "Take my son." And in the silence of him rose a promise made over a hospital bed, a woman's thin hand in his, a whispered, "Keep him safe, keep him laughing." His heart rate did not climb. It dropped. And the part of him that had been retired for years, quietly, without ceremony, came back online. "You're done talking," Caleb said. "Leave now." It was not loud. That was what undid the calm in her, not volume, but the quiet certainty underneath it, the tone of a man who was no longer arguing because he had already decided how the next minute would go. Adrian Crane had spent a lifetime being the most dangerous person in every room she entered, And for the first time she stood in front of someone who made that feel like a misunderstanding she hadn't caught up to yet. It frightened her. And because she did not know how to be afraid without first becoming cruel, her hand was already moving before her mind had finished the thought. She drew back and slapped him across the face with everything she had. The sound was the one the whole café would remember. That flat, splitting crack, dry as snapping pine, the noise that had opened this story. A milk pitcher slipped from a barista's fingers and rang against the tile. Somewhere a chair scraped and stilled. And then nothing. The room did not gasp so much as stop, 40 people suspended in the same held breath, waiting for the thing that always came next. It did not come. Caleb absorbed the blow the way a mountain absorbs weather. His head turned a few degrees with the impact and then came slowly back to center. And that was all. He did not stagger, did not lift a hand to the heat already blooming along his jaw, did not even shift the arm cradling his son. He simply received the violence and let it die against him, and somehow that stillness was more terrible than any retaliation could have been. The crowd had braced for a man to strike back. What they got instead was a man who would not. And in the gap between those two things, the entire café understood all at once that they were watching someone hold back something vast. Eli had gone rigid against his shoulder, fists knotted in the flannel, and Caleb's palm moved up the small back in that same unhurried rhythm. "I've got you. I've got you," steadying a child in the middle of a room that had forgotten how to move. Near the window, Theo Hayes had his phone up, the red dot blinking. He was not the only one. A woman by the counter raised hers. A man 2 tables over angled his without pretending not to. The morning was being recorded now from 3 directions, and Adrienne, flushed, breathing hard, her palm still stinging, turned her head and saw it. Saw the lenses, saw that the room was no longer looking at her with the deference she was owed, but with something closer to judgment, and that the judgment was not on the man she had hit. For the first time she noticed how little he had moved. She noticed the scar running down past his temple. She noticed the complete, unnatural absence of fear in a face she had just struck as hard as she could. Caleb let the silence stretch 1 beat longer than was comfortable, long enough for everyone to feel the weight of it. "Are you finished?" he asked. 3 words, quiet and level, with nothing behind them but the calm of a decision already made. They were not a threat. They were a door, the last one a person gets, swinging slowly shut, and some animal part of Adrienne Crane heard it close even as the rest of her refused to understand why the whole room had gone so still around the man she had been so certain was nobody at all. The big man in the dark coat moved before the question had finished landing. Marcus Webb had spent 11 years protecting people like Adrienne Crane, and the body learns what the mind no longer questions. He crossed the floor fast, one hand already rising toward Caleb's shoulder, the other drifting toward the inside of his coat. "Sir," he said, the word clipped and trained, "put the boy down and step back from Miss Crane right now." It was the voice of a man who had ended 100 confrontations before they began. Caleb did not move. He only looked at him. And it was in looking back, in that half-second of held eye contact, that Marcus Webb's training ran headlong into something older than training. He took in the scar that ran down past the temple. He took in the eyes, flat and quiet and utterly without alarm, the eyes of a man who had decided the outcome of this room and was waiting only for everyone else to catch up. And as Caleb's arm shifted to settle his son higher against his chest, the cuff of the flannel slid back 2 inches, and Marcus saw the faded ink running along the inside of the forearm. 3 words in a worn arc of letters. De oppresso liber. Marcus Webb stopped so suddenly his shoes squeaked against the pine. The hand reaching for his coat fell open at his side. The blood drained out of his face all at once, and for a long moment he simply stared, because the floor beneath him had become a different country entirely. Mosul. The spring of 2017. A ranger element pinned in a collapsed building on the wrong side of the river, walls coming down in slabs, ammunition counting down toward nothing. 2 men bleeding out on a stairwell while the radio dissolved into static and the night refused to send help. Marcus had been younger then and louder, and certain that fear was a thing weaker men confessed to. By the 14th hour, he had learned otherwise. They were waiting to die in that rubble when 4 shapes came down through the smoke without lights, without a word, without a single wasted motion, moving the way judgment moves when it finally arrives. The man who reached Marcus had hauled him up by the drag handle of his plate carrier and pulled him through open fire toward the breach. And Marcus had felt the impacts as rounds struck the plates across that man's back. 2 of them. 3. And the man had not slowed, not flinched, had simply kept moving until the dark spat them both out into the cold and the living. He had turned once under a sliver of moon, a scar down the temple, quiet eyes, a call sign that special operations men said the way other men said a prayer, the ghost of Mosul, Master Sergeant Caleb Monroe. And now Marcus Webb was standing 4 feet from him in a coffee shop in Charleston, having just told him to put a child down. Slowly, deliberately, Marcus raised both hands, palms open, the universal language of a man laying something down. "Master Sergeant," he said, and his voice cracked clean in half on the word. I didn't recognize you. I'm sorry." The café, which had been silent, found a deeper silence beneath it. Marcus reached up and pulled the earpiece from his ear. He let it drop, and it bounced once on the reclaimed pine. "I'm done," he said, not to Caleb now, but to the woman behind him, his eyes never leaving the man he had once watched take 3 rounds to save a stranger's life. "I've been doing her job. I should have been doing mine." Adrienne stared at her own bodyguard as though he had begun speaking a language she'd never heard. "Marcus, what are you doing? Pick that back up." He did not. He did not even look at her, and panic, in a woman who had never been taught any other response to it, turned instantly into the only weapon she trusted, a phone and a name above her. "Fine," she said, voice rising and thinning at the edges. "Fine." She jabbed at the screen and put it on speaker, holding it up between herself and Caleb like something that could shield her. "You want to see what happens to people who threaten me?" It rang twice. A deep, irritated voice filled the quiet café. "Adrienne, this had better concern the signature pages, because I am walking into a briefing. General Doyle." She smoothed her tone into something polished and wounded, so quickly and so falsely that 2 people near the counter exchanged a look of open disgust. "I'm sorry to interrupt. I've just been assaulted. A man in a coffee shop downtown. His child attacked me, he threatened me, and my own security has lost his mind and is refusing to do his job. I need this handled. Tonight." A pause. "Assaulted how? Did he touch you?" "He threatened me. He's standing here holding some crying child and refusing to leave, and my bodyguard is acting like he's seen a ghost." She spat the word without hearing it. "The man has a scar down his face and some Special Forces tattoo on his arm, and Marcus just quit on the floor in front of everyone." The line went silent. Not quiet. Silent. The specific, total silence of a man who has stopped moving. When Lieutenant General Raymond Doyle spoke again, every trace of irritation was gone, and what replaced it made Adrienne's polished expression flicker. "Describe him to me again." "I just did. Work shirt, scar, the tattoo, the crying." "Adrienne." The voice cut clean across hers. "Put him on the phone." She blinked. "Excuse me?" "Put the man on the phone. Now." The command landed with such weight that she obeyed before she could think, holding the device out toward Caleb. He did not take it. He only leaned slightly toward it, His son still settled against his shoulder and said in that same level voice, "Doyle, it's Monroe." In a corridor 2 states away, Lieutenant General Raymond Doyle closed his eyes and let his head drop into one hand. He knew the voice. Every senior officer who had ever touched special operations knew the voice. He knew the missions that did not have names, the pilots pulled out of valleys no aircraft was supposed to enter, the men who wore stars now because Caleb Monroe had decided on some unrecorded night that they would live. Caleb. The reverence in that single word carried clear across the cafe, and every person in it heard it. "It's been a long time. How's the boy? How's Eli?" Adrian's hand began very slightly to shake. "He was having a good morning," Caleb said. "Then your contractor walked through him, broke something his mother made, screamed in his face, and threatened to have him taken away from me. She slapped me when I asked her to apologize." The silence that followed felt geological. "She slapped you." Doyle's voice had gone to ice. "General, wait." Adrian lunged back toward the phone. "He intimidated me. He was aggressive. The situation—" "Stop talking." The force of it made her flinch. "Adrian, you are standing in front of a decorated combat veteran, and the only reason you are still standing is the restraint you mistook for weakness. Effective immediately, Crane Meridian is suspended from every federal acquisition discussion pending review. A person whose judgment permits her to strike that man and threaten his child does not get to build homes for soldiers." In front of 40 strangers and 3 phones, her empire made its first audible crack. The line went dead in her hand, and a moment later, red and blue light began to pulse across the cafe's front windows. 2 Charleston officers came through the door, palms resting near their belts, eyes moving over the room. The senior of the 2, Officer Reyes, gray at the temples, the unhurried air of a man who had refereed too many of these, took in the scene in one slow pass: the broken toy on the floor, the spilled hot chocolate, the trembling billionaire, and the father standing quietly with a child in his arms and a handprint rising red across his jaw. Adrian reached them like a swimmer reaching shore. "Officers, thank God, arrest him. That man threatened me, his child assaulted me, and my security has abandoned his post. I want him in handcuffs." Reyes looked from her to Caleb, to the mark on his face, and his mouth set into a flat, tired line. But before he could speak, Theo Hayes stood up at his table, his voice shaking and his phone already raised. "She's lying, officer." He swallowed and did not sit back down. "I recorded all of it. She cut the line. She insulted half the room. She walked into that little boy because she was looking at her phone. She broke his toy. She screamed at him. And then she hit his dad when he asked her to apologize. It's all here." "So do I," said the woman by the counter, lifting hers. "3 angles," added the man 2 tables over. The kid never touched her. For the first time in her adult life, Adrian Crane found there was no version of events left to sell. Reyes watched the proof gather around her in raised phones and steady voices, and then he turned to her with the weariness of a man who had seen too many powerful people expect the law to bend around their shoes. "Ma'am, turn around. Hands behind your back." "You cannot be serious." The cuffs closed, and that small metallic sound did something to the room that the general's voice had not. The phone call had cracked her empire. The steel touched her body. The 2 were not the same, and her face, as the ratchet clicked, understood the difference completely. She began to shout then, about lawyers, about senators, about careers she would end before lunch. No one moved to help her. The baristas watched. The cameras held steady. Marcus stood aside with his head lowered. Caleb turned his son gently away from it, angling Eli's face into his shoulder so the boy would not have to watch a person taken apart. And it was then, against his neck, that Eli's small voice broke. "Daddy!" The words came out wet and shattered, the 2 pieces of blue pine still clutched in his fist. "Captain's broken. It's my fault. I dropped him." That nearly undid the man the slap could not touch. Not the blow, not the threats, not the ghosts Marcus had stirred, but a 6-year-old apologizing for a toy in the middle of his own ruined morning, certain the broken thing was somehow his to answer for. Caleb pressed his lips to the small head. "No, Bud," he said, low and steady. "Captain's not broken because of you, and he can be fixed. I promise you that." Marcus stepped close and bowed his head. "Master Sergeant, Mosul, you pulled Diaz out of that stairwell. He's got 2 girls now. He says your name every year on the day." Caleb's eyes softened a degree. "Good," he said. Then he settled his son against his chest, stepped past the broken toy and the spilled chocolate and the woman in handcuffs, and carried Eli out into the Charleston sun. By noon, the morning had already outrun everyone who lived through it. The footage spread the way only true things spread. First, as outrage, billionaire CEO slaps single father in Charleston Café, and then, as veterans began to recognize the man in the flannel shirt as something closer to reverence. No one leaked a classified word. They didn't have to. Former operator stays calm while CEO threatens his child told its own story. By late afternoon, Crane Meridian stock had fallen hard enough to trigger emergency calls, and board members who had tolerated Adrian Crane's cruelty as long as it produced revenue discovered their consciences the moment it threatened the share price. Federal auditors announced a review. The veterans' housing contract was frozen. 3 days later, a letter arrived at the carpentry shop. Handwritten on heavy cream paper, the lines crossed out and rewritten where the pen had pressed too hard. Adrian Crane wrote that she had watched the video without sound, again and again, because she could not bear to hear herself. She wrote that she had spent a lifetime mistaking cruelty for strength, because cruelty was faster. She did not ask Caleb to drop the charges. She wrote only one sentence that made him set the page down and sit with it a long while. "I watched your son apologize for something I broke, and I understood I had become someone children apologize to." In court, she came without the white suit, without the sunglasses, without a single assistant. When her attorney rose to soften the edges, she touched his sleeve and shook her head, and then she stood. "Your Honor, I don't contest the facts. I struck Mr. Monroe. I frightened his child. I lied to the officers." She turned briefly toward the back of the room. "Eli, I'm sorry, not because I lost a contract, because I made you believe, even for a moment, that you had done something wrong simply by existing in my way. No child should ever have to carry that." Then she resigned her position as chief executive in writing before the board could take it from her. She could not replace a wooden horse, so she did the only honest thing left to her. 6 months later, a small package reached the shop with no return address. Inside was a little carved bird, clumsy, uneven, the wings slightly mismatched, the work of someone who had clearly spent long evenings learning to use tools she had never needed before. The card held one line. "Some things can't be put back together. Childhood is one of them. I'm sorry." Quietly, with no press release, she had also begun funding a child's airway surgery and a relief fund for veteran families. Not to be seen doing it, which was, perhaps, the first thing she had ever done that way. Eli turned the wooden bird over in his hands. "She learned, Daddy." Caleb looked at the careful, imperfect little thing. "She started," he said. "Starting's good." That evening they sat on a park bench beneath the live oaks while the Charleston sky went gold, Captain mended and glued, and standing guard once more between them. And Caleb understood at last the kind of strength no metal had ever measured, the strength to stand between cruelty and a child without becoming cruel, to absorb a blow and refuse to pass it on, to let a quiet room hold the truth until the truth could defend itself. Because dignity is not weakness dressed up politely. It is power held under control. It is the hand that does not strike back, because a child is watching and learning what kind of man his father chose to be. And that, in the end, is the lesson this story leaves behind. That the loudest person in the room is rarely the strongest. That gentleness is not the absence of power, but the mastery of it. And that how we treat the people we believe can do nothing for us is the truest measure of who we really are. If this story moved something in you, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and to like and share this video so we can keep bringing you stories like this one every single day. We'd love to hear from you. How did this story make you feel, and where have you seen quiet strength like Caleb's in your own life? Maybe you've met someone who chose grace when cruelty would have been easier, or maybe you were that person once yourself. Share it with us in the comments. We read them and we listen, because the most powerful stories of all are the ones you carry in your own hearts. Thank you for spending this time with us. We wish every one of you watching good health, a peaceful spirit, and quiet joy in each new day. Take care of one another, and we'll see you in the next video.